And thanks, Baker. The United States and Europe are trending in opposite directions right now when it comes to the coronavirus outbreak. Europe, which was once one of the hardest hit areas of the globe, now seems to have the virus under control, a stark difference from what's happening here in the United States. But as Europe begins to ease restrictions, countries now realizing the true economic toll of the crisis. Mairead McGuinness is the Vice President of the European Parliament and joins us this morning from New York. Thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell us what you think is needed to help stimulate economic recovery across the EU?
Well, good morning, but good afternoon here. I wore this mask because I want to impress on your viewers that while we are getting the pandemic under control in Europe, we're not taking anything for granted because the pandemic has not gone away. And I think that's true of wherever you are in the world. So we want people to wear masks at the very least. And the economic consequences that you reference are absolutely enormous. But we didn't have a choice because we knew in the early part of this year that if we didn't shut down our economy, keep people at home, safe distancing, all of those measures, then the death toll would be just unbelievable. Already it's too high because we have seen particularly elderly people affected, and all of our member states, I'm thinking of my colleagues in Italy and Spain who are particularly badly affected. So we're aware that this was essential, and we now know that we need a recovery package to put in place so that Europe can rebuild its economy and also maybe rebuild and strengthen its health infrastructure, because we've learned a lesson that pandemics need good health infrastructure, and that we perhaps weren't as prepared, but we've learned a lesson in many ways from what we've just gone through. So we will have this massive 750 billion euro recovery package. It's under discussion. We will have a strengthened budget for the European Union, but all of this is yet to be decided in the detail, but we all know it's needed.
How do you reconcile the competing interests coming from different countries in the EU? I know there are Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Denmark who want a smaller stimulus plan with more strings attached. Then there's countries like Spain and Italy, which were so highly impacted by coronavirus, and they don't really want many strings attached. So, how do you figure out something that works for everybody?
Look, the beauty of Europe is its diversity, both of opinions and outlooks. And I think the strength of Europe is also knowing when that we have to compromise. So you're absolutely right. There are four countries, we call them the frugal four, who are cautious about allowing the European Union borrow money to give grants to those countries worst impacted, or to give very low interest loans. And how we will manage to make progress is, if you like, listen to each other. So last Friday, the leaders met. There was no, big announcement, but they basically said, we're looking at this in more detail. Some countries have more questions than others. But in the end, there is just one reality facing us, that if the European economy doesn't recover, then even those member states who are frugal around money, they will be badly impacted. So in order for all countries to, I suppose, be recovered and to be rescued from this awful depression, we need that the European Union economy prospers. And I think once there is that awareness of all our interests being common, we'll find a way forward. It's never easy. I mean, when you're dealing with 27 countries, it's complex. And the European Parliament also has a role. But the strength of Europe is that in times of crisis, we do actually come to a decision, and hopefully we will in this case as well.
European Parliament members have called for open movement across borders to resume. Is this something that most countries agree with, or are some still hesitant?
Look, at the beginning of the crisis, as you know, some countries just closed borders immediately, and that impacted on the supply of goods, medical goods and food, etc. So that was eased off a little. But yes, there are some countries who are more cautious about opening borders. But the Commission is trying to do it at an EU level so that there isn't, if you like, any country blocking people moving. I think we're all very conscious, though, that we need to be alert to the dangers of a second wave. And therefore, everything we do, including in my country, Ireland, where we're gradually removing restrictions, has got to be with a warning to citizens that really we now need to be very responsible. We also know that our tourism sector, which is a huge part of the Italian economy, all economies, the Irish economy too, it needs to be revived because it's on its knees. But we're doing it with all the public health guarantees and qualifications. So, for example, I took a flight from Dublin to be in Brussels yesterday morning. You don't get on a flight without a mask, and there's all warnings and sanitation, which is absolutely how it should be, because we were safe when we were at home, and other people were safe as well. No more than I wearing the mask at the start of this interview, it's actually to remind us that this pandemic is really serious, and that I think if we drop our guard, we could see borders closing again. And that's not something we like to see across the European Union, because we pride on being able to move freely between member states. So look, we're cautious about it. Some countries have concerns, but we are definitely moving towards a better place. Although, as you know, in some member states, we're beginning to see in certain regions a spike in cases in certain sectors of the economy. So we're mindful about all of that, and we're working towards making sure that we can contain. So we're testing, we're tracing back, we're giving the public health advice, and we're giving leadership. And I think that's hugely important.
Of course, you started this interview, as you mentioned, with the mask on, just to drive home the point, at how important masks actually are at preventing the spread. Here in the U.S., mask wearing has somehow become political. The EU has managed to really flatten the curve and get things under control when it comes to coronavirus. In the U.S., though, cases keep climbing. Do you envision more countries putting travel restrictions to the US in place, and even for US travelers coming, any type of quarantines? What do you think that the future holds if the US cannot get the pandemic under control?
Well, look, I think we all should look at the public health guidance, because I'm a politician. I'm not a public health expert. So I don't make the rules, but I certainly understand that those who do make them have the expertise. So we have the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, and we have the World Health Organization. And luckily, our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach in Ireland, Leo Varadkar, is a doctor. So we had good combination of all those skills. And, we are all concerned wherever we see an increase in deaths, whether it's the US or Brazil or even in some member states. It's something we all share. It's a human tragedy. And I think we have to show leadership and be really conscious of doing the right thing and giving the right signals. When it comes to travel, of course, we're being cautious. Member states are saying, look, travel if it's necessary, but we're beginning to ease up. So some countries with the big tourism sector are, if you like, opening their tourism facilities with all of the restrictions and precautions around that. I mean, we want to see the world being able to move again. I don't think we're going to see the same level of movement for some time. Yesterday, we discussed where we're at in terms of a vaccine, and we're making sort of, rule changes to make sure this vaccine is not only developed, but tested and then made available to everyone. Because I think the key to this is the finding of a vaccine. But I think it would be a terrible tragedy for the world if only some people had access to it. So Europe is being very altruistic in this regard. It's, pledging of money to develop the vaccine has been hugely important. Supporting those labs and universities, absolutely vital. And whoever finds the vaccine, wherever in the world, I would hope that it would be a shared discovery and available to those who absolutely need it, and not those who are excluded through their vulnerabilities. So we have a big challenge globally. The pandemic, has taught us things that we perhaps should have known. First of all, don't take nature for granted. Secondly, invest more and better in our public health systems, and communicate perhaps better in the early part of this pandemic, so that people understand why you shouldn't stand close, why coughing and sneezing etiquette is so vital. I'm now at a stage where when I hear somebody cough, I'm shocked, and I'm turning around to make sure they're wearing a mask. And literally in this house, honestly, we're policed really strongly, and it's so good, because some colleagues were kind of wearing the mask under here, or putting it here, or putting it here, and no, it doesn't work. You need to cover your mouth and your chin. That's absolutely vital. And, our services are coming up to members of parliament and saying, please put on your mask, which isn't an easy thing to do to politicians, but we're listening, we're heeding, because ultimately our health is at risk, and more importantly, the health of others. If we don't take the right precautions, make the right choices as leaders, as we are, then I'm afraid what can we expect of citizens? So I've seen so many tragedies in this pandemic, and sadnesses. Even people couldn't bury their loved ones, couldn't go to a funeral, which in Ireland is such a big thing for us, that I do not want to see any more tragedies. And it's why every time I hear in Ireland that we have no deaths, or in Europe that we're improving, it lifts my heart that we're doing the right thing. But we've come through a very difficult path, as indeed the US is going through. And you need unity around this. It shouldn't be political. This is much more important than politics. This is life and death.
I'm glad you mentioned even the face masks, because we have a lot of people here who wear it on their chin, and a lot of lawmakers have come out to say, no, that does not work. You have to wear it to cover your mouth and your nose. That's how it's effective. You mentioned the vaccine. is there real concern on your end that perhaps a pharmaceutical company might develop a vaccine and it's going to be difficult to get it to people who really need it? The US has pumped a lot of money into vaccine development. Where do you stand? Are you worried that perhaps it will go to the US first or to China first, depending on which pharmaceutical company develops it?
Well, remember, the pandemic didn't ask what nationality you were. It just hit people all over the globe, rich and poor, old and young. And therefore, when it comes to developing a vaccine, the world should be united, because we're going to need to look at all sorts of options here. And Europe, has led the way in terms of a global response. So, I mean, in this parliament, we are committed to making sure that there is access to this vaccine. Because, sadly, I watched Contagion for the first time at the weekend. And indeed, it's quite frightening how art is mirroring life. And it would not be good to see that some parts of society would have access to vaccine because they have money, and others denied that. Because remember, when anyone is at risk, when one person is at risk, everyone is at risk. So I think the world, needs to be more united than ever, which sadly it's not always. I think those who are global leaders need to be very conscious that their words and actions have an impact. It can be good or bad. But I think morally and ethically, I mean, as a politician, I could not see or ever stand over the idea that only we would be looked after and not the rest of the world. When you think of the developing world, when you think of those countries that don't have the resources, frankly, we have a responsibility to make sure that access is there. I suppose the first challenge is, can we develop a vaccine? Will it be effective? And I think we're in that phase now. But while we're doing that work, we need to talk about the reach, the accessibility, because I keep repeating this point that if there's one person vulnerable to this pandemic now and isn't following the right advice, it risks everybody's health and well-being. So these are big, big global issues, and I wish the world were in a better place to deal with them. But we've been handed this, disaster now. Europe in the beginning didn't respond wonderfully, but after a week or two, we got our acts together. And I think we are more united around this common purpose of looking after the health and well-being of our citizens, but also having a global responsibility.
All right, Mairead McGuinness, Vice President of the European Parliament. So great to have you on this morning. Appreciate it.